part 2 of my Want to Be a Viking class. Preface, if you haven't seen me talk before, I am super ADHD and ramble and wander, and if you like a more coherent class, then there are people who are very good at that. One day maybe I'll be very good at that too. So, if you're new into the SCA and you want to be a Viking, just hang out with people. The SCA is really good at helping people get into stuff and share stuff, and there's lots of cool kind of Viking Age helms and garb and stuff. But for me, I think it's easier to do it right the first time than it is to kind of do it whatever and then try to relearn it. Because the SCA has got a lot of trouble keeping its information consistent. So last time I talked about some basic ideas of where to find clothes, a little bit about how to get your head wrapped around personas and what to do for armor and some ideas. So I'm going to kind of follow up with that a little bit with Lamellar. Lamellar is the most common and prevalent type of Viking Age armor in the SCA because it's really lightweight if it's aluminum. It's easy to get your hands on because a lot of people like it and use it. And it really works against rattan. That said, it's extremely uncommon in the Viking Age. And I know I touched on this in the last video, but I would encourage you that if you're going to wear Lamellar, you have to focus on an Eastern persona. Be it Burka, Kiev, Novgorod, or any of the other now Russia-based settlements that were connected to the Viking Guard in Constantinople. So I figured I'd talk about that a little bit. So unlike the West, which most of our Viking stories are based around, Vikings sailed and they discovered new lands and they pillaged and they conquested and they just terrified everyone. In the East, the Swedes sailed the Baltic regularly and they would regularly trade with the nearby coastal areas. And they had regular trade routes. Now, as they went further and further into what are known as the Slavic lands, and the name Slav directs from the word slave comes from the word Slav. The Norse would take slaves and then trade them further out. And eventually they discovered a couple rivers like the Dnieper. For life of me, I'm going to forget. But if you just Google the main riverways of Ukraine, you'll see them right away. And the first settlement the Norse made was Novgorod. And that's where they really started. By Norse, I really mean the Swedes. From there, they have pushed south into the settlement of Kiev. Initially, what we believe happened was that the Viking Age people would trade with the Khazars on those rivers, who were mostly Islamic merchants, and they didn't want to go further into the steppes because of the Pechenegs, who were like precursors to the Mongols. So, they'd take their ridiculously lightweight, narrow-bottomed ships, and they'd sail down these remarkable rivers until they eventually found the Black Sea, Caspian Sea. I know all these things, and then I don't know whatever I needed to know the minute I'm talking about them. At any rate, they found Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, but at the time it was the greatest city in the world as anyone knew it, especially in the Western world, and the Norse peoples called it Miklagard, or the Great City. Rurik was the first real prince of Kiev, and he had some kids, and they started intermarrying with Slavs, and eventually you came to Vladimir. And Vladimir made a deal with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. Basil was worried about a military coup to take his throne and hired 5,000 Swedish, Slavic, Rus soldiers and would name them the Varangians or Northmen. They did so well and were so loyal that he made them his personal bodyguard, worried about assassinations from other Greeks. And this would last for hundreds of years. And after a while, Danes and Norwegians and later Anglo-Saxons would come and join this Viking Guard. And they'd be used as personal bodyguard units, heavy armored shock troops, well, I guess medium armored for the Byzantine. Most Byzantine soldiers came out in phalanx style, really light, from what we understand from reading their military chronicles, which there's a lot out there to find if you Google it and do some research. Most of them used very light padded armors, if at all, and had these long phalanx style pikes. And then they had these really awesome medium and then later heavy armored cavalries, big Lamellars, right? The Vikings still fought on foot, so they would ride to battle on horseback and then dismount and become either like guardians of the rear or the personal bodyguards of the emperor or baggage train guards or frontline shock troops, and they did super well. When they weren't in the field, they'd be obviously bodyguards, torturers, city police. They were known to be very drunken, often being cited as the wineskins of the empire, the emperor. They had a great time. They got paid really well. And after a little while, to get in, you actually had to pay, I believe it was like £1 of gold. It was a lot of money to get in. But then obviously you'd make a ton back, way more than what you paid to get in. Not to mention you get the best equipment, and they'd have all sorts of wild adventures. When we look at the stories of Harald Hardrada, the very last Norwegian king who died at Stamford Bridge in 1066, like a week before William the Conqueror would land. Harald was a Norwegian deposed prince who built up a large retinue, made his way all the way to Constantinople, joined the Viking Guard, ended up fighting all over the Mediterranean and fighting the Moors in Sicily, just totally wild adventures before he would eventually come back and unify Norway and attempt to take England. He sacked York and then obviously died at Stamford Bridge. The type of armor that we really like in the SCA, that Lamellar, is Byzantine. So if you're really into that, round shields or the center boss small kites like you see, which are really Russian Byzantine styles, are all really popular. There's a lot of cool Eastern helms that have names that I can't pronounce, like the Gorzezbo, which is the style I wear. But if you're going to do that, wear Eastern helms. That's my take. Don't wear the Spagan helms and the oculars or the conical helms with the little nasal piece like you'd see in the Normans. Stick with a kit that makes sense for its geographical and cultural iconography. I might have just made that word up. Iconography might not be a word. But anyway, stick to a time and place. The Normans are also a really great one. Rolf would attack France, Paris a couple times. Now, the backstory to this is the end of the 8th century, you had Charlemagne, Charles the Great, would be crowned emperor by the Pope. And at that time, he had fortified all those northern rivers like the Rhine, and you could not mess with them. They were awesome. Their military was great, wonderful cavalry. They decimated everyone who they came across, into the Slavic lands. The Saxons, forced conversion, helped drive out Islamic invasions to the south, despite losing Roland. But, when he died, he left his kingdom to his only surviving son, who left his kingdom empire really to his three sons, who immediately divided it into what would be now like France, Germany, Austria. And no wars have ever been fought over that, have they? Never. So those didn't go too well, and resources got pulled away, and then the old garrisons at the mouth of the Rhine were left unguarded. And if I'm getting my river wrong, I apologize. My geography brain gets really short-circuited sometimes. And Danes would continue to sack France and Paris, and they'd pay what they call Danegeld, which is pretty much they'd pay them to go away. Eventually, Rollo came down, and at that point, I believe it's Charles the Simple. See, the French kings did it to themselves. Would give Rolf the land of Normandy, Northmen's land, and make it a county. It would later become a duchy, in order to man those old garrisons and protect, Frankia from more Vikings. And they did, and it was great. And they learned French, and they took French wives, and they converted to Christianity. There's a funny story, and I don't know the truth of it, but it's a cool story, and don't let the truth get in the way, right? Of Rolf, his Christian name being Rollo, being told to kiss, was it Charles? No, or Lewis? Oh my God, names. Boy, I know everything until I'm doing a video. Any rate, the Simple King's feet, and he's like, "Oh, I've kissed your feet, huh? Hey, buddy of mine, Hrothgar, you do it." And he knocked the king down, picked his foot in the air, and kissed his foot there. I don't know if that actually happened, and if his name was Lewis and not Rolf or some other thing, tell me in the comments, and the name of the river, because I don't know why I'm spacing this stuff. I feel like I should know it when I'm doing these kind of blogs. Any rate, the Normans would end up adopting a lot of the Frankish military style. Instead of doing like what the Varangian warriors did, where they were cavalry who then rode and dismounted and fought shield wall, they started being mounted lancers. The knit, the servant mounted warrior, who would later become known as the knight, especially once the language transferred to English. Vikings, knights, Viking knights. You want to be a Viking knight? Go Norman all the way. The knit. We believe that most of the mail was being made in Frankia. The best steel was being made in Frankia, if not further south from there. They had great gear, and the Vikings would keep their wild, independent spirit. They would obviously end up under William, 100 or so years later, end up conquering England and running around and building these, stone fortifications that at that point Saxony never had. And so a small amount of Norman knights could hold, most of England. And then they would immediately go on the Crusades, 20 or so years after 1066, William's conquering. So you have this time period of Viking knight crusader overlap that I don't think we really think about. So you get this early crusader style armor, the conical helms, the early gambesons, the coat of mail, the large kite shield, which is, from what I understand, and I don't have the direct information on this, so you have to do your own research, but a lot of the kite shield idea was taken from the Byzantine armies because they were really good mounted shields, right? They weren't nearly as mobile as the Viking style center boss round that you can kind of rotate around and hold together easily on foot. But, they guarded your flank on horseback, and if you had to dismount, they still worked great in a shield line. The long spears were used as early lances. By the way, back to the Varangians, the two-handed axe to cut down cavalry, right? I'd say then the Norman Vikings had initiative because of their long spears and their cavalry. The Byzantine Varangians were, counter artillery, right? Big Dane axes supporting the line. Off topic. So there's two really good ways to go. Don't forget the Italo-Normans. That was a huge thing too. We don't hear about it as much because we're English-speaking peoples from that descendant line. But the Italo-Norman thing was just as big, if not bigger, and more relevant than the English Normans. And then your third big one would be the Saxons. The Danes settled in Saxony and were huge influence, converting to Christianity, taking land and wives, taking over I believe it was Northumbria and Essex. I think it was East Anglia that was really holding out. Again, you can tell me in the comments. Fighting guys like Ethelred and Ethelstans and all those kind of cool names. King Knut was the most well-known of the kings of the Danelaw. But, again, we are guild, Dane guild being paid, and after a while, these once proud warrior sailing Vikings had taken fertile lands and wives and converted to Christianity, and they were more like the Saxons than they were the, Norwegian sea kings, conquering in Dublin. York was a settlement of the Vikings, Jorvik. So you have another place of the conversion. So there's all this great, combination of Viking and Saxon culture. I don't really think I have as much to say about that. There's a ton about it that I think is pretty well known. And if it's not, there's some wonderful historical fiction about that. There's even a great show on Netflix you could go look up. It's called The Last Kingdom. It follows a character named Uhtred of Bebbanburg during the time of King Canute. Now, although Uhtred himself might not have been a person, the historical events around that, the big key events did happen. So it's this wonderful historic fiction, comparable to the 13th century Icelandic sagas. The names and faces may have been changed, but the basic story beats are there. Of course, you could go to Ireland and you could, not really settle because they don't have Roman roads like they did in England, but just, form Dublin. And then you have like the Hiberno-Norse, these like intermarried children of Vikings and Irish women who would, help raid and trade and, take a lot of slaves there. You can go to Iceland and say, listen, I want to get away from the politics and the conversion going on in Norway and Denmark, and a lot of Norwegians, right, taking Irish wives, so the Norwegians heavily involved in Scotland and Ireland, the Danes heavily involved in France and England, the Swedish heavily involved with Ukraine and Russia. As far as kind of broadly where those places went, Iceland was the wild, wild west. Just take some land, build the long haul, and just they're cool too because they didn't really have the jarls and the kings, konungs, or drottings, like war leaders. They just had their own council, their own, kind of like the founding fathers of America. They made their own democratic state. At a thing called Olthing they'd go to every year, and the Icelanders would have these landowners who would go and vote on things, and there were all kinds of crazy laws. The Icelandic law books are really fascinating if you ever want to read those, again, online. You can learn a lot on the laws. If I remember, of both the Danelaw had their own law codes that were still preserved, and the Icelandic ones,